Hey folks, welcome to the Hasura community call. If this is your first time joining the Hasura community call, hi, I'm Vish, I'm your host. The Hasura community call is a monthly event hosted every last Thursday of the month at 9 a.m. Pacific time. And this is a place where our engineering and product teams hang out with our community members and they showcase cool features that they're working on, exciting product updates, a deeper look into the roadmap, RFCs, and everything awesome, you name it. So, before we get started today, let's take a quick look at the agenda. So we do a customary Hasura product update that our CEO and co-founder Tanmai Gopal gives. It's a 10-minute product update, but it has so much information that it usually just blows my mind. So looking forward to that one, followed by a short demo by Vamshi on one-to-one relationships and what's new. This month we have two major sections, which is the first one is about multiple data sources, BigQuery and Citus, and the other one is about security updates. So a lot of really cool features that we want to show you today. Without giving much away right away, let's get started with Tanmai's product update and let's get into it. Tanmai, you're
All
up
right, all
next.
right. Thanks, Fish. Hey, everybody. Hope you're all doing well. I shall quickly share my screen for a short product update from my side. So let us dive into it. So two things on two specifications that we're starting active work on. That I quickly want to take you folks over. One is the inherited roles spec, and the second is the schema sharing specification. And so let's take a quick look at that. These are two things that we've just started work on. So once you see these RFCs, would love to kind of get your inputs on them. So for those of you who know, we have inherited roles, which kind of allows you to start thinking of Hasura roles more like scopes. And then you can have an inherited role, which is a combination of those scopes. This makes a bunch of things easy. It's been fairly interesting to implement this internally because there's a little bit of SQL generation and the union thing that we do to kind of make that work well. So we started this off, and you'll see this behind an experimental kind of feature flag. So we started this off with supporting just selects on the databases that we support. So with Postgres or SQL Server or BigQuery or Citus, with selects, you'll see inherited roles working. But inherited roles or this composition does not work yet for everything else. Next week onwards, we're starting work on making sure that it can support other things as well. So we'll first start off by supporting queries and mutations on remote schemas and actions as well, so that kind of works. We'll start off with the simplest case, which is when there are no conflicts. And so, which is probably going to be the kind of most common case that you have. The second piece of that is we're going to introduce kind of both the UI, but also the metadata kind of semantics for resolving conflicts. So that means that, you have a particular query or a mutation, and the permission rules for that are conflicting. Maybe it's like a different preset. And so you kind of need the ability to override that conflict and say that, in case of this conflict, take the preset from this particular role, or just have a new preset altogether, right? And so kind of calling out those conflicts and allowing you to override them, that'll be kind of the second phase. And third phase is around kind of the UX of making that easy. So we're going to start work on this starting next week onwards. So if you folks are using inherited roles and you've been waiting for inherited roles, would love to kind of have you involved in that portion of both trying it out and giving us some feedback. So that's on the inherited roles side. The next thing that we started work on as well is what we call schema sharing. So this is a quick look at, well, I mean, there are two parts here. The first is when you look at the console design, it's a little bit different because that's kind of what we're gradually moving towards without disrupting things too much for the existing console. But on this console, I think one of the main things that I want to talk about here is this ability to kind of load in sample schemas, which is both a collection of database models, but also some metadata. And this kind of makes certain bootstrapping cases easy. So for example, if you hit the schema gallery, right, we're going to start maintaining a separate GitHub repository where we'll have this kind of set of sample schemas that we'll kind of put together. And the idea here is that, for things like there's certain best practices around, setting up a chat model, right? Or a real-time chat model with a typing indicator and with subscribing to kind of notifying last messages, read messages, right? Stuff like that. And there are best practices in the way that you construct those subscriptions and queries and set up the underlying models and the metadata for it, including permissions for threads and groups and stuff like that, right? Or a simple kind of order management system, right? For looking at a subset of an e-commerce situation, or even if you're just starting things off like a blog thing, right? To start off with. So we'll kind of have a bunch of sample schemas here. And then if you kind of load up any one of them, you'll get to see what the underlying models and the underlying SQL that's going to kind of get added is, and the associated metadata for that as well, including, relationships, permissions, what tables, functions, computer fields, etc. get tracked. And then you can kind of add that schema to your existing, either kind of your empty database and your empty metadata database, or even to an existing environment, as long as it doesn't conflict, right? If there's a conflict, then Hasura will roll it back so that it doesn't conflict with what you have. But the idea here is that if it's not conflicting, kind of add it to your existing system. And then, of course, you can kind of go poke around and modify that, right? And rename things and stuff like that to kind of make it more suited for your use case. So the initial plan is that we'll bootstrap this with a bunch of kind of questions and common examples that we've seen from the community. We have a bunch of sample apps. There's a bunch of them that are good kind of reference applications that we'll start putting on the GitHub repo. And then, gradually, of course, would love kind of your contributions in creating these sample schemas as well. There's an interesting pattern or interesting way that you model something that you'd like to share. You can kind of add that to the GitHub repo as well, and then it'll pop up on this kind of schema gallery that people can kind of add to their system. So that's on. So that's kind of what the schema sharing piece will look like. Before I move on, if you folks have any questions, please just feel free to kind of keep hitting me up on chat, and I'll take those questions. But those are kind of those specifications that will go live on. You'll see them come up on our repo, and then would love to kind of have your feedback on those things. Yeah, Ross had a good question of, as inherited roles kind of become more mature, will we have ways to make the permission rules and parts of them more factorable and reusable? So yes, that's kind of the primary idea behind inherited roles, right? Which is to be able to kind of reuse those rules that you have instead of rewriting them. But there are a few internal ideas that we've been poking around with, right? I think primarily what we're starting to see, especially from users who are kind of using Hasura in an existing environment, is this need to kind of have a bridge so that you can reuse auth policies from an external system inside Hasura, right? And I'm guessing that's what you're referring to, Ross, right? With things like also OSO. I don't know how to pronounce OSO. But basically being able to kind of bridge that. We haven't explicitly planned that out, but it should be possible to do today already, where we can kind of do that transformation, right, from an external system into the Hasura system, because it's all just kind of JSON, right? So there should be a bridge that's possible, but I think it'll be interesting to kind of see those use cases. So Ross, if you have like a few early thoughts, please feel free to open up an issue, and just like if you have like a mock repo or a setup or something that we can play around with, that'd be awesome. Exactly. That. Yeah. So Ross's comment, I said exactly, but I'm just going to read out Ross's comment. Ross's comment was basically, we can kind of take that external policy system and materialize that in a table inside Postgres, and then Hasura authorization policies can just reference that table. And that can be pretty generic because if you have an ACL table, right? Let's say you have a table that has like resource name, resource ID, user ID. That's kind of your mapping, right? All of the other permissions on Hasura models become like exists lookups on that permission table. So that is another really good way of bridging that, right? So you kind of keep materializing something from that external authorization system into a table or a view inside Hasura, and then Hasura's permission rules can reference that. And that's what we've seen actually people do most commonly. The other part is kind of that transformation bridge so that it can be live. But please do create an issue with, like, if you have like a repo or something where people can play around with that, that'd be amazing. And then we can kind of keep discussing along those lines. All right. So those are the kind of two things that we are working on this month. There's 2.0 Alpha 11 onwards. You should also be able to bring in a read-only Postgres data source. Before 2.0 Alpha 11, Hasura did not allow you to connect to a read-only Postgres data source because Hasura needed that Postgres data source for metadata storage as well. But now it's no longer required, and event triggers, which also have an impact on your source database because we need to kind of install those triggers, right? That is also now optional and it's automated. So you should be able to point that to a read-only Postgres data source and have it work. And do try it out and let us know. We're going to be trying this out with things like split graph and stuff, which should be like very interesting use cases there. Next is also that next week we'll be launching SSO support on cloud and on the enterprise version as well. So if that is something that you need or want to try out, hit us up and we'll enable that and get some early feedback there as well. All right. Otherwise, I think the other thing that I wanted to mention, which is sort of not product related but process related, is that you would have noticed that we have been a little bit slow on our GitHub issues on the open source repo in kind of just making sure that things are actively updated. This was unfortunately because we spent the last few months in doing a little bit of kind of tooling internally, where we weren't able to kind of be as responsive to those issues as we would have liked to be. However, there's a lot of work that's been happening behind the scenes on those GitHub issues as well. Specifically, there have been two kind of performance specific cases that people have noticed that have languished, I think, for a while, and so those are actively in work and should happen in the release next week or the week after, and we should be able to test that out. But thank you so much for your patience, and if you and hopefully you should now kind of notice that we're back to being as responsive as possible on our GitHub issues, and things will hopefully just pick up from there. Otherwise, just a quick shout out to what Vish is probably going to talk about towards the end of the call, which is HasuraCon, which is coming up towards the end of this month, which has a whole bunch of super cool product work that we've been talking about that we've not talked about yet, surprise things, and so that'll be happening as well. So please do register and join in for that. There's a bunch of super cool stuff that we'll be launching there, but mum's the word otherwise. Thank you so much, folks. I'll be around on chat to keep answering questions, and back to you, Vish.
Thanks, Tanmai. That was an awesome update as usual. And also thank you for keeping mum on that, because I literally thought that you stole my one big update. Anyways, folks, let's jump right into the rest of the agenda for today. Up next is Vamshi with his demo on one-on-one relationships and what's new with it. And also followed by two really cool demos on our newest multiple data sources, BigQuery and Citus. So let's hear from Vamshi.
I'll talk about a small feature that we've launched recently, one-to-one relationships. Right. So GraphQL Engine currently handles the most common data modeling relationships you have. If you have like one-to-many, many-to-one, or many-to-many, they're usually handled quite well. But slightly uncommon, but useful modeling that GraphQL Engine prior to Alpha 11 did not handle, which is one-to-one relationships. So one of the use cases where you would see this is, imagine you have a table and there are a large number of columns, and over time, let's say the table becomes really large with a lot of nullable columns. You typically want to like split this table up into multiple tables, but at the same time, you do not want to lose the kind of guarantee that you had with a single table, the kind of data integrity guarantees. So like one way you would want to do that is, the simple strategy would be, let's say I'm extending user with the user detail table with an extra column. One simple strategy would be to like reference the user ID, but this kind of is not great because you could have multiple user details for the single user, and that's not something that we want. So a quick workaround, a quick way to solve that is to have a unique constraint on the user ID, at which point you might as well remove the ID and just use the user ID itself as a primary key, but at the same time, it also references user ID. So this is like this table, and with this table, like you want to establish one-to-one relationship between the user and user detail. And prior to Alpha 11, what GraphQL engine couldn't handle this. So if the console sees these two tables, user and user detail, you would see an array relationship from user to user detail, and you would see object relationship from user detail to user, which is correct. But the array relationship is not something that's as per to your table modeling, right? Ideally, even in the GraphQL schema, you want to see a one-to-one relationship between these two tables. So we've added this little feature where you can do this. I'm just going to quickly demo that. All right, I have these tables in this particular database. I'm just going to track all. Once I have this, you can see that the console now infers one-to-one relationships. From user to user detail, you see an object relationship, and from user detail to user, again, you see an object relationship. This was not, this wasn't the case earlier. So I'm just going to go ahead and track all. Right. So what does this bring us? So I'm just going to. Right. The advantages are, first thing would be a better response shape. Previously, user detail, you would see an array of these things, but now as appropriate, you would see an object. And then because user detail is now an object relationship, you can use it in ordering. So you can use complex ordering clauses, like you can order user by user details location. And similarly, even you can use this in filtering. So all of these automatically like improve the API because it's an object relationship. And at the same time, even like when it comes to mutations, so if you want to insert into the user table along with the user detail in a relational insert, that becomes possible. And this also like becomes possible from the other way. That is, even from the user detail, you can insert the user data uh, directly. So all of these API improvements become possible. So that's one-to-one relationships. And after this, I'm gonna head into the new database support that we've added. Yes. Right. I'm just gonna switch data. Right. So recently we've let's start looking into like a slightly different use case, which is OLAP, where you have really large data, and like Postgres is not typically used for that. So you have databases like BigQuery, you have Citus, which usually solve problems for this particular domain, where you have terabytes and petabytes of data, and you want to run some analysis queries on that. And so first up, I want to show support for a BigQuery database. Okay. By the way, Google has been recently running into issues with BigQuery. Okay, managed to load this. All right, so I have a Google project set up, which has a BigQuery dataset. And so this dataset has millions of rows, and this is pretty much copied from a public dataset that Google has made available. And I'm gonna add this dataset to GraphQL engine, and I'm gonna run some queries on these tables to show GraphQL engine support for BigQuery. All right. So I see the tables that were listed in that particular data set. I'm going to track them. Unfortunately, unlike other databases, BigQuery does not have notion of foreign key constraints. So because of which the console cannot suggest relationships. So we'll have to like manually go ahead and add these relationships. So cycle hire has a foreign key to cycle station. So I'm just going to define one such relationship. Start station. Just going to run a couple of queries. Right, if this is a typical GraphQL query where we are fetching the relationship and there's a limit attached to it. So what's interesting with BigQuery is that the execution engine is unlike what we have prior to this. So with Postgres and SQL Server, we were able to convert this entire GraphQL query into a single SQL query with the by pushing JSON aggregations into the database. But unfortunately, this BigQuery does not have the necessary primitives to do this. So what we instead do, if you look at the analyze plan for this, is we have a data loader approach. So what happens is that to like to fetch data for this particular GraphQL query, step one is that we fetch the data of the cycle hires table. And from there, for all the interested cycle hire tables, we do a fetch on the cycle stations. This would be step two. And then a join happens on GraphQL engine in Haskell. So the join happens at the application layer for this. And so this would definitely not be as efficient as pushing like SQL query down to the database. But unfortunately, given that BigQuery doesn't have these primitives, this is the best that we can do. And BigQuery is particularly geared at running these like long operations. So even the API to like run a query on BigQuery is to submit a query, you get a job ID in return, and then you wait for this job to complete. So that's so this is in line with what you expect from BigQuery. And at the same time, like when possible, we try to like minimize the number of queries. For example, this query is using a relationship to like do an ordering on the cycle hire table. But if you analyze this particular query, you see that it's just a single execution step, and we were able to like push the join into the SQL query in the first step and satisfy the requirements of this particular query. So that's BigQuery. So currently only queries are supported, and like mutations and subscriptions are not something that we're not currently looking at because they are not the typical use cases for BigQuery. You're storing petabytes of data and you're running you have long running queries on them. So we have query support for now. Next, I'm going to talk about support for Citus or hyperscale. Citus is kind of what you can call a hybrid database. It can scale to like handle like really large amounts of data, but at the same time, it's quite fast in the sense that if you have like a small amount of data, you expect its performance to be on par with Postgres. So it's kind of like a hybrid database that can scale from like minimum amount to like extreme like terabytes of data. Let me quickly support for that. So I have a standard Citus database setup with a large amount of data. So Citus luckily supports foreign key constraints, even though it can handle large amounts of data, and because of which the console can suggest relationships between these tables. However, Citus has different kinds of tables. You have like local tables, reference tables, and distributed tables. So not all kind of relationships are allowed by Citus. So the console only suggests what are possible. And so typically, like in the typical use cases, all of them are supported. And the API. Like it works as expected, and with Citus, it's similar to Postgres in the kind of aggregation operations it supports. So if you look at the analyze output, you see that it's a single SQL query, even with several relationships. You can see that the plan is slightly different to Postgres because you have like a distributed query planner. On Citus, currently we support pretty much everything. Like you have support for subscriptions, support for mutations, but unfortunately we do not yet support event triggers because of limitations on Citus. And we're closely working with the Microsoft team to see if there are any workarounds that we can use.
I'll go downstairs.
Yeah.
I'm bothering you.
All right, that's pretty much it, folks. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Vamshi, there was a question by Radha on are one-to-one relationships supported between views and tables?
Yes. Yes. So that's a really good question. So it is possible, and it's not exposed in the console, but directly through metadata, you can do this. So like when we added one-to-one relationships, so the server does like a lot of inference on how to order the inserts when there is a relational insertion query. But when it comes to like views and tables, you'll need to like mark the insertion order. So that's the only caveat, but it's all possible. Yes, the answer is yes.
Yeah, Vamshi, if you could link maybe to the metadata docs or something, that'd be useful.
Yes,
but that's but that was awesome. The only thing I wanted to add to the demo that Vamshi was showing with Citus and Hyperscale is that it's actually a flavor of Postgres, which means that, you know, if you want to kind of start scaling out your Postgres workload, right, then it should be pretty straightforward to take some pieces of that data and then move that to something like Citus or Hyperscale, and have kind of a scale out enabled on that. And you know, that can then kind of power, you know, both subscriptions and queries on, you know, where you're ingesting kind of really large amounts of data for you know, for different kinds of use cases, right? Like a logging use case or a chat use case or IoT use case, right? Stuff like that. So that's something that is very exciting. We're going to experiment with a bunch of these kind of scale out Postgres systems internally as well. That's something that we're doing over the course of the next few weeks, especially as we're kind of we've done a few experiments with kind of scaling out our internal monitoring system as well on Hasura Cloud, and so there's quite a few interesting things there. So hopefully we'll get to talk about that soon too.
Awesome. That was awesome, Vamshi. Thank you so much for those amazing demos. Before we move on to the next segment, which is the security segment, where Solomon and Tiru are going to talk about the new security features, let me give a quick shout out to our community presenter today, who is Gus Fune. Gus is going to talk about role-based access control and authentication with Hasura and super tokens. So just to say that Gus will be going right after the security segment that we have. So please make sure that you hang around for his session. All right, folks, we are good to go. Solomon, if you're ready.
Hi, my name's Solomon, and I'm on the Cloud API team. And I'm just going to go over a feature we've been working on recently which is adding support for Postgres client SSL certificates to the cloud, to Hasura Cloud. And so just for anyone who doesn't know what that is, Postgres has support for using SSL certificates for client authentication when you're making your connections to the database. And so this is like, just to, if you don't know what that means, it's very similar to like when you're using SSH, and if you want to, you can use an SSH certificate for authenticating your connection instead of a password. And so currently we have support for that implicitly for both open source and on-premise pro. And that's just has to do with the way that all of this stuff works, where the way you use client certificates with Postgres is that you have like a root certificate for your server that issues a key for your client, and then you generate a key and a certificate that you generate for your client. And on your client's file system, you store that certificate, and when you make your connection to Postgres, you just pass in the file path to those certificates as query parameters in the Postgres URI. So in open source and on-premise pro, as a user, you have full control over the file system, and you're manually constructing the connection strings. So you can really easily just create your certificates, put them on your client file system, and use those file paths when you make your connection strings, and it works just out the box. But that doesn't work for cloud, because as a user, you don't have access to the file system. When you're using Hasura Cloud, it's a shared environment with a number of different users, and nobody gets any visibility into the file system. And that's really important for security reasons. So up until now, we haven't supported the SSL certificates for Postgres on cloud, but that was something that people wanted, and it's really useful. It adds to the security of the whole your connection, and it's a really good feature to have. So we wanted to find a way to do that. So the sort of basic requirements for any implementation were that it needed to work, whatever we did needed to work securely in a shared environment, and where the user had no visibility into the file system and didn't have to, in any form, like in the form of logs or anything, and also just didn't need to worry about the file system or where things are stored or the security of their certificates. Everything needs to be opaque, and we wanted to integrate it into the existing metadata API and console UX in like as simple a way as possible. So the way we sort of did that was taking advantage of the existing environment variables system that we use on cloud, which despite the name, they're not technically environment variables like you would have in an ordinary Unix system. They're not system-wide. They're actually entries in a HashiCorp vault that is per project. So a HashiCorp vault is just like a secure way to store in memory secrets in a key value store, and where everything is encrypted. And so all of your environment variables are stored in this vault and are encrypted. So we thought maybe that would be a great way to leverage an existing part of our multi-tenant system that people are already familiar with. So so we're using this. We're using nvars to as a user, you would store your certificates in the nvars, and then at runtime, for every connection string that has nvars associated with it, we'll look up the secret data, write it to disk temporarily, construct a connection string, and then make the connection. And then when the project is taken down or restarted, we'll erase all of that data from disk. So in other words, so the way that works internally is that when you start up, when your project is launched, we look up the source metadata to see what to check for the connection string if it's present, or if there's environment variables for the connection string, and if there's environment variables for any of the SSL certificate data. If we find environment variables for the SSL certificates, then we'll look up those environment variables in the vault and then write them to disk and construct a connection string. And all of this happens internally inside the engine. You don't have to worry about any of it, and none of it gets exposed in logging or anything like that. And so just to show how you would use this in the console, when you're creating a new source or updating a source, you'll have the option to add these custom mvars. Or sorry, let me take a step back. Before doing that, the first thing you would do is you would go into the cloud console and you would create all your mvars for all of your data, for all your certificates, and you can just use any arbitrary names for these mvars. So here's my root certificate, client key, etc. And you just paste in the actual data for your certificates, and all of this gets stored securely. And then when you go to create your source, you'll have the option of enabling client certificates, and you do that by selecting the nvars that correlate to the certificates for whichever source you're adding, just using these drop-down menus. And then alternatively, if you like to use the metadata API directly, you would simply, when you do the PGA add source request, you would add this SSL configuration key with an object containing all of your mvars for all of your different certificate data, and just like this. So you can use either way. And now I'm going to just show you a quick demo using the metadata API, how you can go about doing this. So, how do I make this not full screen? There we go. So here I have a just a project. Here's the console for an empty project. It's just got one database, which is just the default one here. And I'm going to add a second database that is on Google Cloud Platform that's using a client certificate. So over here, I've already created all these nvars because these secret data, so I don't want to show the actual values in this call. But I've created all of these environment variables that have the URI for the host, and then all the certificate data, and then you'll see root cert, client key, client cert. So and then I'm going to use the metadata API because we haven't merged in the console UI stuff yet. But so here I'm going to do a request on the metadata API with PG add source, and you'll see I'm using the exact same environment variables: host, client cert, client key, root cert. And I'll just make this request. And we get back a success, so that worked. And now if I go back over here and refresh the page in the console, you'll see now we've got PG1, which is the Postgres database from GCP. And if I show the connection string, you'll see that it's just the host nvar, so nothing related to the certificates gets revealed in the cloud console, and the same goes for all of the logging. Everything gets redacted in the logging. And now, just to show that it works, I can track a table in here and make a query. So let's track this table, and then there it is. Yeah, so this is data coming from Google Cloud Platform using a SSL client certificate. So that's it. Thanks. I guess the next steps with this are to get the console UI merged into main. I believe there's a pull request right now, so that should be coming soon, and we'll see this in an upcoming release. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Solomon. That was a great update from your end. Next up, we have Tiru with a few more security updates.
Hey folks, so I'll be talking about 3 new security features that we are just about to launch on the cloud and enterprise products. And let's jump right to it. The first one is an extension of customizing your API limits. So as if you have like a public facing API, or if you have like high load and you want to restrict what kind of operations can be run. This is like a typical problem with GraphQL because it publishes the entire schema, so people can use whatever they want. This is a way to like restrict what runtime characteristics you actually want with your API. So we already have an API limit deployed called depth limits. So that is a very important feature, which in which like you can say how many like how much nesting you can actually have in a GraphQL query. So similar to that, we are actually going to talk about this new thing called node limit. And it's basically a way for you to restrict the total number of nodes. And what is a node? A node is basically a field, an object field, which has a selection set. So as an example, if you have like a users table, then you can probably query ID and name. So there is one node in this query, right? And similarly, if you look at this, the right side here, you can see that it's slightly more complicated. But in short, this, and this are object fields with selection sets. So this operation has 3 nodes. So now we'll see how you can restrict that and what it means to like restrict an API with a node limit. So I hope you can also see my terminal. I'm just going to increase the font size here. Okay. Not sure if it increased. Oops. Is the terminal visible? Oops.
It is.
Okay. I don't know how to say yes on this window. It's a new OS. I'm trying. So anyway, so I have here a Chinook dataset which has tracked few tables, created few relationships, usual stuff, and it has permissions on few tables and few roles with those permissions. So it has public role and user role. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a query like this with say a public role, right? And if you notice, this query actually has like three nodes, artist, albums, and categories, and it actually goes through. And what we want to do is restrict the number of nodes, right? So I'm going to now change. I'm going to apply this node limit, and that is defined in this in my metadata file. And if you look at the bottom here, I have this key called API limits, and it has this subfield called node limit. And there are 2 types of limits that you can set. One is at a global level, which means that all the roles okay, so I think I should first talk about the per role setting here. So node limit you can define per role. For example, you can say a user role has node limit of 2. You can also add any other role here, give it custom limits. And finally, you can then give a global node limit, which means if you haven't defined anything explicitly in this per role setting, then the global limit will be picked for that particular role, right? So I'm going to apply this metadata, import node limits. And if you see here, my node limit again was by default, I wanted 1 node to be executed, and for user role, I wanted like two nodes max to be executed. So let me try and do that here. So this has 2 nodes, and I can see operation node limit exceeded. And if I change this to user, I can see that the user role goes through. Now let me, in this user role itself, let me go and like ask for one more role. So I'm going to say album1, alias this, and here I'm going to say album2 and request for album IDs again. So this has 3 nodes now, and if I run this, I get node limit exceeded. The depth of this is still 2, if you notice. It's just artists and albums, but since we have more number of fields, like more number of nodes to be more specific, we get this node limit exceeded. So that was the first feature, and this is the metadata. We'll also have a UI pretty soon. I'm doing this using the metadata API directly, but we'll have this in UI. The second feature that we're going to do a demo of is disabling introspection. So if you use GraphQL, you know that the introspection powers like the documentation, the autocomplete, and all the cool things at the client side. But that means that you're also giving more information than maybe what your client requires. And introspection by design gives all the details of the schema, so you want to probably disable that on a per role basis. So again, this has this UI and has a metadata spec. I'm going to show a quick demo with the metadata spec here. So let me show you what that looks like. So at the bottom here, there's a new key called GraphQL schema introspection, and it says disabled for roles public. So we don't want to show any introspection for the public role, but for user role, we do want to show that. So let me go here again and import this new metadata, which has introspections disabled, right? So for user role, I still see the schema here, but let me go and change that to public. And now I can see that I get an error, introspection is disabled for role public, and I don't see anything here, right? So this is an important feature again for exposing less information in your GraphQL API. The third feature is a very powerful feature. It's called operation timeout. It's basically a way for you to configure on a per role or a global basis, like how many milliseconds do you want the execution of your GraphQL operation to take, and if it exceeds that that time, then the operation is just killed, and the user gets like a timeout error. Right, this is very good again for like keeping the system performance kind of predictable. You know that you cannot have any operation which runs for more than this time, and it also this timeout also percolates to all the other systems that Hasura connects to, basically the database, right? So if you have a timeout, not only is the web connection closed with an error, also like the Postgres query is going to be killed. I don't have a demo for this in the image that I'm using, but this thing is also ready to go live pretty soon. So yeah, these were the 3 features, and if you have any questions, I'll be on chat. That's it from my side. Vish, over to you.
Thank you so much, Tiru. These were really power-packed security features. So thanks for those really cool demos. Now, without further ado, we are on to our final demo, which is also the most exciting one because I'm slightly biased and I love community demos. So calling Gus for the community demo today. And he will be talking about how they implemented authentication with super tokens on Hasura at OffScript. So Gus, whenever you're ready.
Hi, everyone. So happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm Gus, as presented by Vish. I'm CTO of OffScript. We are a small startup in Stockholm, Sweden. We are enabling people to create their own shop online without inventory, etc. Let's talk about our challenge. We started with Hasura from the start and do some constraints on our setup. We were having problems with JWT tokens, refreshing, etc. And we were looking for a new solution, and especially one that was more open source, community-based. And it happens that we found about, let me share my screen. So, hang on. Yes. And that's me without long hair and beard. And we decided to use super tokens, which is, we found very similar to Hasura in the sense of having a growing community, Discord, well documented, a lot of cool people are using, and it has a different take. And when we tried to implement on OffScript, we found out that we couldn't use JWT because of one specific security design of super tokens. The JWT key rotates as well. So that means that either we find a way to keep updating the JWT key on our end, or we build via webhook, which is something that not a lot of people I've seen using on Hasura. And that's basically a server that keeps connecting to Hasura and authentication providers, see if both matches, and if that's valid, you can you authenticate the user and the specific role. We started to build our own small server for that. We also tried first using Lambdas and API gateways, but we decided to make a full-fledged dedicated server, mostly because of latency. And in the end, we figured out that it was faster than even using some JWT providers out there. And so we decided then to, after a few months running internally, we decided to open source how we built it in a repository called Hasura Super Tokens. Gonna be pushing an update later because I found some bugs when preparing for this demo. And basically it follows the webhook pattern that we use. You keep a side server and that connects back and forth. So I prepared here a little demo that it's based on a small fictional chess kingdom environment where we have 4 different roles that have different permissions. And we've been also using an Next.js example that is with super tokens. We slightly modified it because we have we created an action so it can communicate to Hasura super tokens. Then it will create a user on super tokens. That ID from the user will actually be the one that will be connecting the super tokens user on the super token cloud on your own Postgres database. That's if you're running super tokens locally, and the Hasura user. So here is, we built that in Fastify and now in TypeScript, so you can pretty much modify. As I said, this is a slightly different version from what we're using in production because we have some special session variables that we implement in the webhook. So let's go to the demo to see how it works. So I'm going to, this is the running Next.js. I'm going to sign up. Let me just refresh to make sure that the server didn't drop. Yes. And I'm going to add a username that I prepared, a password, 3, and sign up. And it's taking a while because I'm on 4G, because I'm without internet here today. There's a big storm in the region. And okay, so let's go here and see a user. So this is the user ID that was generated, and this is the session handle that is this is basically, we send this to Hasura as well. So Hasura checks with Hasura super tokens to say, okay, this user, if I just pass a user, anyone could try to forge and say, okay, does this user ID exist or not? So we also send the session handle so we can return, okay, this combination matches a user, and this is the role for the user. So you can prepare. So it's important that we have both. So, so if I go back here and I see on the users, you will see that my user was created, user demo, and has a role of a pawn. So if I come here and I add the user and the session handle, you might notice that the user table was open there. I was doing some debugging, so do not do this in production. I can do this because it's a demo. And then if I enable those three, it takes a while because it's going back, and you see that we found the castles. So as the pawn can know where the castle, which are the castles. But maybe if I go here and change my user to be a knight, and I go back here and change the role to knight, I see that now I can see which castles has princesses or princes, sorry. But if I try to put a monarch, which would know everything in the realm, it will not return the princesses if the castle has a princess, because that's not a role that this user has. So everything was happening. If I change again, it all happens in real time. So we'd have no delay or no need to refresh keys back and forth. At the moment I change on Hasura, the user will have immediate access on your implementation of the platform. So if I go here and just do a refresh, now I can see the state secrets, all of them, because I have full access. And there you go. So that's pretty much the demo. We will be looking forward for our inherited roles in the future, so we can implement this. I believe that will work almost out of the box. Right now, what we've been doing in our production environment is, if it's a user, but it has a specific role, it also, if I'm not sending a role value, it will fall back to a user role. You can also see that in our webhook source code. In this case, it was modified. But you can customize this, use whenever you want. And if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer on the chat or on Twitter or via email whenever you have inquiries. Thanks a lot for this great opportunity, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much, Gus. That was an amazing demo and even more amazing implementation that you showed us. That was pretty impressive, especially the stuff with the custom session variables and the, out of the box support for authentication. Yeah, so I am also dropping a few links in the chat because, as Gus mentioned, their implementation is also open source, and you can also find a Docker image that you can play around with. So feel free to have a chat with Gus on our Discord, or you can reach out to him on Twitter. Any feedback would be very much welcome. Thank you so much again. And now we are ready to wrap up our community call. Let me quickly share my screen. One big update. So every time I usually wrap up the community call saying what the next date for the next month's community call is. But as you know, that our community calls happen on the last Thursday of every month. And next month, the last Thursday is when we have our conference, the Hasura User Conference. And HasuraCon is about listening to our user story, stories from our user community, things, the awesome things that they're building, and also showcasing the stuff that our team is working on, awesome product updates. And that's also basically what the community call is about. So what I'm trying to say is HasuraCon is the biggest community call of the year, and you absolutely do not want to miss it. So join us next month on June 23rd and 24th for the big Hasura user conference. The agenda just went live recently, and it's packed with 2 days of talks and workshops. The talks will feature Hasura product announcements, awesome user stories that we love talking about, technical and in-depth deep dives on our product stuff, and the workshops will teach you how to get the most out of Hasura. So do check out the agenda. We'll be adding more to it pretty soon, but this is what we have now. And so make sure that you register and you check out the awesome sessions that we have so far. Yeah, that's about the HasuraCon stuff. And also, we're always looking forward to improving all of our events, especially our community call. So you can help us make our community call better by dropping any feedback that you might have for us. And this is the form that you can use, hasura.info/com10. We'll also be sending out emails to you where we'll link you to the slides, to all the demos, these feedback forms and stuff like that. So keep your eyes peeled for it. And if you're like Gus and all of our other community presenters and you're working on something really cool using Hasura and you'd like to share your user story in our upcoming community calls, make sure that you reach out to us anywhere on Twitter, on our Discord. We have various community channels where you can just reach out to me or the rest of the team and let us know. Or you can also use our form for the community call demo to let us know that you'll be interested in showcasing what you're working on. So yeah, that's it for today. Thank you so much for joining us and see you at HasuraCon next month.